And so similarly, so we talk about conservation mass energy. So similarly, when we talk about mind, we can ask two questions. When did our mind begin? And we can say our mind began when we were born, or at least conceived. But then we can ask a slightly different question. When did mind begin? And in Buddhism, we have a similar theory as conservation of mass energy, conservation of consciousness, that you can't create it, you can't destroy it, you can only transform it. So even though we can talk about the mind of this life had a beginning, mind in general, like matter and energy, according to that conservation law, is beginningless. And this is what we see here also in this book I quoted from Alan Wallace. He says the same. He says, the central principle of modern physics is the conservation of mass energy. This means that matter and energy may undergo innumerable transformations from solid to liquid to gas, from thermal to electromagnetic energy and so on. But no quantity of mass energy is ever lost, nor does any form of matter and energy ever arise from nothing. In Buddhist thought, we encounter similar theory of conservation of consciousness. It says an individual's continuum of consciousness undergoes innumerable changes, from waking state to dreaming to deep sleep, from emotional turbulence to serenity and so on. But consciousness never vanishes, nor does consciousness ever arise from nothing. The Buddhist view is that mass energy does not transform into consciousness, nor does consciousness disappear into mass energy. Mass energy is conserved as mass energy, and mental events, including consciousness, are conserved as mental events. Thus, this theory refutes the belief that consciousness originally evolved from mass energy as an emergent property. It also denies that the consciousness of a fetus arises purely from the physical conditions that produced its body. With regard to consciousness, the Buddhist theory is compatible with much scientific evidence about cosmology, embryology, and death. However, it stands in opposition to the materialistic interpretation of that evidence. So, therefore, here in the Buddhist theory of mind, where does it come from? One of the implications, of course, it's beginningless. Just like in classical physics, mass energy is beginningless, even though we can talk about Big Bang and also the beginning of our life, of course. And therefore, not only it doesn't come from nothing, meaning beginningless, it also means endless, means you can't destroy it at the end of the life. So, they also, in the terms of the universe, there's different theories about what will happen to this universe, and one, of course, is that it'll implode and end up to nothing. Another one, it'll completely expand. So even though maybe they talk about an end of this universe, that doesn't, of course, mean an end of matter and energy. It would be violating the fundamental principles of classical physics. And then one other thing here, which I think is very relevant here, again, just reading from Alan Wallace again, he says, according to Buddhism, consciousness is regarded as an event or continuum of events, rather than as a thing moving through time. Energy also can be best understood as an event, and even matter, which appears to us so thingish, dissolves into a matrix of events when it is closely examined. So Buddhism is not arguing that the mental realm is just and real and tangible as the physical world appears to be. Rather, it asserts that the substantial appearance of the world of physical things is deceptive, and that both physical and mental phenomena are best understood as interdependent events. This implies that no phenomenon exists with its own intrinsic independent identity, because each phenomenon depends on others. In Buddhism, this is a key concept. And I think this can be very helpful in not only understanding the material world, but understanding mind. Because if we look at the material world sort of superficially, it seems like there are things there moving through time. I mean, it seems like there's a cup here moving through time. More or less the same cup that was here yesterday, will be the same cup tomorrow. But actually, if we look closely at the material world, are there any things moving through time anywhere in the universe? Is there? Is there anything moving through time? Because if we go down to the atomic and subatomic level, there's just flux and change. Flux and change. So in the material world, you won't find anywhere any static entity moving through time. But that's how it appears to us, and that's what we believe. But if we investigate closely, we'll see there's just a flow of change happening. There's just a flow of change at the physical world level. Similarly, the mind. It seems like our mind is moving through time. But if we look closely at the mind, all we see really is continual flow of mental experience unfolding. There is no static thing, the mind, moving through time. Just like there's no static cup moving through time. And as Alamal says, in Buddhism, this is a key concept. And as we're going to see shortly, in fact, not appreciating this is really the root cause of all of our mental afflictions and suffering. And so if we can experientially appreciate this, that there are no things there moving through time, there's just flow and change, it would have a dramatic positive impact in our life. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. So that is, where does it come from? Where does the mind come from? What is its nature? What is the nature of the mind? So here we can talk about this in two ways. We can talk about the conventional nature of the mind, and the conventional nature of the mind is just the fact that it is clear and knowing. How do we come to realise this? Is simply by observing the mind. I mean, in science, if we want to understand anything, what do? We observe it closely, don't we? And they do that in science. Observe things closely to understand them. But it's a bit funny or a bit strange, though, in science, when we come to knowing about the mind, we don't observe the mind. What they do, they observe behaviour, they observe the brain. They don't observe the mind. So here, if we really want to understand the mind, like anything, we need to observe it. And if we observe the mind directly, we will come to see its conventional nature. We'll come to understand. Just like if we observe fire closely, we'll come to understand that it's hot and it burns. Like anything, we'll understand the nature of things. So similarly, if we observe the mind, we will come to directly see that the mind is clear and knowing, or has clarity and awareness. Of course, now, it doesn't seem like that, because now our mind is full of agitation, mental afflictions, and our mind is dull and distracted, so we can't really clearly see the mind. So it's a little bit like now, if we have a container, a clear container of water, and there's a lot of sediment in the water, if we shake it up, the nature of water is clear. But does it look clear if it's full of sediment? No. In fact, if you've only ever seen water like that, you go, someone says water's clear, you go, no, look, it's not clear. Look, that's our mind. So if someone says your mind is clear, you go, no way, because we've never seen that. But what do if we have a container of water with sediment? We put it down and we let it rest. What happens? The sediment goes to the bottom, we see the clear water. Similarly with the mind, if we observe the mind and allow the mind to settle down, and we just observe, then we'll see this clarity that's now obscured for us. And we'll start to see this knowing quality of the mind. So we will really come to understand this conventional nature of mind simply by observing the mind. Like any phenomena, just observe it directly. But then we can also talk about what's called the ultimate nature of the mind. And the ultimate nature of the mind is, how does the mind exist? And for this, we need to investigate. Because if we just look, then like everything else, the mind appears to exist completely independently. Just like when we look at this cup, the cup appears to exist completely independent of us. And if we just keep looking, that's not going to change. So similarly, if we just look at the mind will seem to exist there from its own side, independent of everything else. So we need to investigate. And if we investigate, then we'll come to see, like everything else, the mind does not exist from its own side. It does not exist independently. Why is this important? Is, again, the Buddhist assertion is that because we do not see things clearly, we do not understand how things exist, we have mental afflictions and we have suffering. So that's the nature of the mind. Conventional nature is just clear and knowing. We can understand that or see that by just observing the mind. And we can understand the ultimate nature of the mind, how the mind exists, by investigating the mind, to come to see that it does not exist from its own side, that it's an interdependent phenomena. How does it function? How does the mind function? So let's have a look at that now. Our mind is literally the creator of our experience. It doesn't seem like that, but that's the case. Because actually, when we look around the world, at the world, what we're receiving, of course, is a mass of sense data, particularly visual data. And we have to make sense or meaning out of all of this stuff, otherwise we can't function. So what we do is we draw lines around various collections of data and we create meaningful objects to make sense or meaning out of all of this stuff. And we do more than that because we're not living in this world in isolation. So in order to communicate with other people, we need to give names to the things we've created so we can communicate. And so literally we are creating our world of experience by drawing lines, creating objects, and then giving names to make sense or meaning out of all of this. And of course, how we create our world of experience is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary, depending on the meaning that we want to get out of this world. There's no sort of fixed objective world there at all. For example, how many things are there? I think particularly in Israel, but most cases, probably the most meaningful thing to do would be to draw one line around all of that data, create one object and call it a star. But maybe on some other occasions it's more meaningful to draw two lines to create two objects and say there's two triangles there. On another occasion it may be more meaningful to draw 6 lines, create 6 objects and say there's 6 triangles there. Maybe on another occasion you have 7 lines, 6 triangles and a hexagon. Or on another occasion, maybe more meaningful to say there's a collection of 18 lines there. So how many things are there? Is there 1, 2, 6, 7, 18? How many things are there? We decide. We decide. There is no objective reality out there of a star. There's no objective reality of anything there. We create reality by drawing lines and creating objects. So therefore, the star or the 2 triangles or anything is not existing from its own side. The star only exists in our conceptual framework, in our conceptual mind. There's no star beyond, outside of that. And that's a key point. And of course, we need to do this. We need to create meaningful objects, and otherwise we can't function. So there's no problem there at all. But the problem is, we don't realise that. The problem is that even though our mind is creating this world of experience, it seems like it's already there, independent of our mind. There seems to be already a world out there made up of many separate, discrete things. So what we've done actually is we've turned the lines that we've drawn, we've turned them into boundaries. We're seeing the world as already divided up into many separate, discrete things, and we're just coming along and confirming, yeah, there's a cup there, and so forth. It seems like it's already done, but it's not done. But you might ask, well, what's the problem? What's the problem with seeing the world as already divided up into many separate, discrete things? Here's the big problem. That if we see the world as full of boundaries, as made up of many separate discrete things, then whenever we experience anything, we have this mental factor called feeling present always. And in Buddhism, feeling doesn't mean emotion. Feeling is simply experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Neutral just means neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So let's say we're looking at this flower over here. We are creating the flower because all of there is just a mass of sense data. I mean, we could create one flower, we could create 50 petals, we could create lots of things, but probably most meaningful, we draw one line and say one flower there. But of course we don't realise we're doing that. We think that there's a flower there existing independent of us, so we've turned the line into a boundary. And then of course the problem with that is, let's say we're looking at that flower and we're having a pleasant experience. That pleasant experience, together with the belief that that flower is there independent of us, of course will naturally lead me to assume there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant experience. So we'll see that flower as attractive from its own side, because it's there, independent, so it's attractive from its own side. But of course, here, according to Buddhism, this is a misconception. Because if that flower was attractive from its own side, it would mean that actually everyone who looked at it would have to see it as attractive, because the attractiveness is there. But I'm sure that not everyone in this room who looks there sees it as attractive. In fact, some people may see it as quite neutral, and some people actually might think it's quite ugly. So is this flower attractive, neutral, or ugly? From its own side, none of those things. From the side of the observer, all of those things. But we don't appreciate that. We get stuck here. Because of these boundaries that we've made, we think that that flower's there. Then we have this misconception that it's either attractive, unattractive, or neutral from its own side based on our experience. And once we get to that point, then what happens next is, again, let's say we're looking at that flower and having a pleasant experience. And I'm seeing the attractiveness is inherently there in the flower. I like pleasant experiences. I want pleasant experiences. That flower seems to be causing my pleasant experience. I want that flower. So that's attachment. Or if I'm having an unpleasant experience when I see that flower, together with the belief that that flower is there independent of me, then I don't like unpleasant experiences. I don't want unpleasant experiences. That flower seems to be causing my unpleasant experience. Get it out of here. Aversion. And if it's a neutral experience, that will just simply reinforce my mistaken belief that that flower is there independent of me, which in Buddhism is called ignorance. So what we find is that by turning lines into boundaries, then based on our experience, we end up with really attachment to pleasant things because they seem to be the source of our happiness, aversion to unpleasant things because they seem to be the source of our suffering, and then just more false belief if they're neutral. And these are what's called the three poisons in Buddhism, the poison our mind. And these are the three main mental afflictions. All other mental afflictions like anger and jealousy and craving, hostility, fear, anxiety, and so forth, all of those come out of one of those or a combination of them. That, then, of course, is what's driving our behaviour. And every action we do based on one of these mental afflictions has a result, and the results of those actions are our experiences, and part of our experience, of course, we're suffering. So this is how boundaries lead to suffering, to mental afflictions and suffering. That's the problem. Is not understanding that we are creating the world of our experience with our mind. In most of our experiences, the very first line we draw is we draw a line around here and we create me. Because actually we have single experience. And in single experience, there are two aspects, experiencer and experienced. And we need to distinguish those two aspects to make sense or meaning. And I think a newborn baby is not able to do that. They have to learn to do that. So we have to distinguish experiencer from experience, otherwise we don't make sense of anything. So drawing the line, creating experiencer, we can label it experiencer, subject, me, whatever label we want. To distinguish from the experience. We must do that. But of course the problem is we don't realise we are creating me, the experiencer. What we're doing, of course, is we're turning into a boundary. We're grasping onto the me part of the experience and seeing ourselves as independent of what we experience. There's me here and world there. And so this is what's called in Buddhism self-grasping. But this way of seeing ourselves is completely irrational. For example, is this big? Is it big? You can't have big on its own. You can't have big and small. You can only have big relative to small, yeah? Like that, you can only have up relative to down, in relative to out. Like that, you can only have me relative to not me. Experiencer, experience. Subject, object. Only exists relative. So when we grasp onto the me part of experience, which is only relative to what we experience, of course, we're completely out of sync with the interdependent nature of reality. That we are fighting against the interdependent nature of reality. And if we fight and struggle against the interdependent nature of reality, if we're out of sync with reality, we have mental afflictions and suffering. And we often induce a lot of suffering onto the people around us. And very often, we are very much out of sync with reality. Because this boundary here that we create, that we make, this me boundary, often is very strong. Because we often have a very strong perspective of me doing this, me going there, me saying that. It's always me, with this view that there's a me here and then the rest of the world there, independent. The more we grasp, the stronger the boundary, the more likely the mental afflictions, the more likely the suffering. Sometimes in our behaviour, this boundary is not as strong, this grasping is not as strong. And this happens sometimes when we're more focused on the activity than the me doing the activity. For example, absorbed in reading a good book, absorbed in watching an interesting program on TV, absorbed in fixing a problem at work. On those occasions, we're more focused on the activity than the me. So this grasping, this boundary of me is not as strong. And we know from our own experience in those occasions, things seem to go quite well. Time seems to go quite quickly. Not so much problem. And that's even taken one step further in people who've developed a high level of focus in their activities. For example, professional musicians, professional athletes who spend thousands of hours of training in their activity. So much so they've developed a high level of focus in their activity. And so they often say that when they're doing that activity, they're sort of in the flow state, they're in the zone. Even to the point where they often say, actually there was no sense of me. There was just the activity happening, just the music playing. Not only that, but in that occasion they report peak performance, optimum performance. Why? Because we're much more in harmony with the interdependent nature of reality. This boundary making is not very strong at all. It's really largely dropped away temporarily. But it's only temporarily dropped away due to increased focus. So of course, that's a good start, but to really overcome mental afflictions and suffering is we really need to appreciate there are no boundaries anywhere. We need to investigate ourselves, the mind, the phenomena. We need to investigate to come to see there's no boundaries anywhere. There's no independent me, no independent world. And if we can realise that actually this world is a world that we're creating, including me, we're creating the me and the world, then we'll be able to cultivate boundless love and compassion for everyone. Because now, with boundaries, well, there's me here and of course them there. If they're suffering, well, that's not my problem, that's their problem. Oh, okay, if they're friends or family, maybe I'll help them. If I don't know them, I don't care, it's nothing to do with me. And if it's people I don't like, well, I hope they suffer, they deserve to suffer, because they're not nasty people. So this is our behaviour now with boundaries, is that we really just look after ourselves and maybe a few people close to us, the rest we couldn't care less about. Whereas, if we realise there's no boundaries anywhere, there's no boundary between me and anyone else, everything's interdependent, then if suffering is arising, whether it's in this body, that body, equal, the natural response is compassion, because there is no difference in boundary. Of course, that doesn't mean we all become one big blob, so we're not saying, as actually some people wrongly understand, when we talk about this no boundary, often people go, oh, we're all one. We're not one. One is dualistic way of talking. There's one and many, or same and different. When we realise no boundary, we realise that's not big, that's not small. Do we realise that big and small are one? One means identical. Big and small are not one. They're not the same. They're not identical. What we realise is that big and small are not two, meaning not big, not small. So we need to be careful how we think there. We're not going to be all become one blob. I mean, there's still big and small. Big and small exist. They're not the same, but they're not different. They're not big and small. That's boundaries. So that's what we realise. And also, of course, when we realise that, going back to the example of the flower, now with making boundary, if we're having a pleasant experience, then it seems like the beauty is there. But if we realize no boundary,